General Conference 101, one of many communications resources that are being made available to you about General Conference. Now, the purpose of General Conference 101 is to provide clarity on what exactly General Conference is, why we have General Conference, and how what happens at General Conference will impact your local church. Today, I'm here with three members of the Mississippi Delegation who have graciously decided to join us today. Here with David Stotts, who is the first elected layperson to the delegation. Also to his left is LaToya Redd Thompson, who is the conference lay leader and also a member of the delegation. And then rounding off our panel here is Reverend Fred Britton, who is the first elected clergy person and who is the head of the Mississippi Delegation. Thank you all for joining us today and taking time to explain what legislative committees do and how this plays a role in General Conference as a whole. So Fred, what are legislative committees, and then what do they do and how many of them are there?
The Commission on General Conference has the responsibility to determine the number of legislative committees to properly do the work at General Conference. For the 2020 General Conference, that number has been set at 14. All petitions, properly submitted petitions and report to General Conference are assigned to each of these. They are assigned to the legislative committees. These committees, when they are in session, they will debate the proposals assigned to them and determine whether to approve, amend, combine, or reject them for recommendation to the full body of the General Conference.
So what role do members of our delegation serve in legislative committees? How are delegates assigned to these committees?
They are assigned by the head of the delegation, and the process for that is that we requested that each of the delegates would submit 3 choices of legislative committees on which they'd like to serve. And then because of using the order of their election, we determine which committee they will serve on. And ultimately that is decided by the head of the delegation.
So you make that call?
Humbly.
Okay. So as you're at General Conference, what's a typical day in the life of a delegate while serving on these legislative committees? Because I hear there's some pretty long days.
There are some long days, but they're full days. They're exciting. During the first week, each day begins with an inspiring worship service at 8 a.m. After the worship service, there's a plenary session that lasts about 45 minutes to an hour. Then after that, the delegates will move into legislative committees, into their respective legislative committee to do the work that they've been assigned to do. Each day adjourns at 6:30, except for on Saturday. On Saturday, legislative committees are allowed to stay in session until 9:30 that evening. But all of the work must be completed by 9:30 p.m. The next day is a day of Sabbath, time for us to gather and to worship together and to rest and get ready for the second week that's ahead. And during the second week, each day begins just like during the first week. There's a worship service that begins at 8 a.m. And then for the rest of the time, the rest of the day, General Conference will meet in plenary sessions to consider the legislation that has been sent to them from the legislative committees. It is an exciting time. It's exciting to be a delegate at General Conference, but it's hard work, and a lot comes before us. And so you have to be prepared for that journey. But there's a lot of exciting times during General Conference as well. Some of those things, for instance, during the worship service on Monday, May the 11th, deaconesses and home missioners will be consecrated for lifetime service. That is a high and holy moment, and it's exciting to witness that. On Tuesday, May the 12th, the General Conference will recognize our retiring bishops. And one of those bishops is our very own Bishop James C. Swanson Sr. Also on that day, we will celebrate the 80th anniversary of the United Methodist Committee on Relief. And just think about all that has been done over those decades because of the people called United Methodists. Indeed, there's a lot of opportunities for us to give thanks to God and to celebrate what He is doing through the people called United Methodists.
Fred, you said that there were 14 legislative committees, correct?
Correct.
And so there are over 860 delegates from around the world representing United Methodism. That's about 60 or so people a committee. That's a lot of people on a committee. LaToya, how do delegates decide who governs the legislative committees?
Well, Jazz, the Council of Bishops appoints a bishop to chair each legislative committee, and the Secretary of General Conference appoints a secretary for each committee. Now, these people's sole purpose is to organize the committee. And this is how that's done. The legislative committees meet. Their first order of business is orientation of the committee. Then the next thing that happens in the legislative committee meeting is they elect officers. The officers elected are chairperson, vice chairperson, secretary, and subcommittee chairpersons. These persons are elected by a separate sequential written ballot. And diversity is considered. Diversity with respect to ethnicity, gender, age, geography, and clergy or lay status.
So once these officers are elected, how do they know what their specific roles and responsibilities are as a committee officer?
It's the responsibility of the Secretary of General Conference to provide for training for officers. So there's a training held for the chairperson, vice chairperson, secretary, and subcommittee chairpersons. Each person, each officer holding those positions must attend that training in order to serve.
So David, what happens after officers are elected and then trained?
Once they're trained and ready to go, basically, then the committee looks at the legislation that they have and determines, do we need to break into subcommittees? Subcommittees basically allow us to have a fewer number of folks to discuss the petitions. So if a committee gets way too many petitions that they can handle by themselves, because everything has to be heard and voted on. And so if there's more than they can do as one group, they'll break into subgroups so that each can hear them. Now what that adds to it then is the subgroups have to come back, present to the full legislative committee, because that's where the vote has to be taken as it's sent to the plenary floor.
So after the subcommittees complete their work, what happens next?
All right, so when the subcommittees complete their work, it goes back to the full plenary, and then the plenary makes that decision. Do we adopt it as it came from the subcommittee? Do we amend it? Do we reject it? How do we vote on it? How do we do? And we take our vote, and that's how it goes forward to the plenary, and it'll go back to the committee that deals with putting the agenda together for the next day. So you'll know what's coming the next day on there. And it also can find its way to a consent agenda, that if there was a certain number of people that voted for it, it can go to the consent agenda and actually become the rule unless there's a group that will bring that back off. But that's how you basically get everything to the floor so that the items that have the most need for discussion will be able to be voted on. But at the end of the day, at the end of General Conference, every petition that was sent in will be dealt with.
So that's how legislation flows from being created to making it to legislative committees and then being pushed forward so that it can be voted on and showcased or illustrated to the whole plenary. Very interesting. Thank you all so much for coming to explain the step-by-step of how legislative committees do their work.